Greetings and salutations. This is the Adjutant. There are moments in life when you realize that being intelligent is not the same thing as being wise. There are moments when you discover that understanding facts is not the same as understanding people. And there are moments when life quietly reveals a blind spot that you didn't even know you had. Today's story is called The Day I Learned Pain is Not Competition. Looking back, I think one of the greatest mistakes I have made as a younger man was believing that I understood suffering. Now, don't misunderstand me. By the time this story takes place, I had already experienced a great deal of hardship. I had grown up in an environment that was far from ideal. I had experienced rejection. I had experienced instability. I had experienced disappointment. I had experienced the constant pressure that comes from trying to build a life without much of a safety net beneath you. Now, those experiences taught me many valuable lessons. They taught me resilience. They taught me discipline. They taught me perseverance. But they also taught me something else, something I didn't recognize until much later. They taught me to compare suffering. Now, at that time, I didn't realize I was doing it. Most people don't. We think we're simply just being logical. We think we're evaluating reality. We think we're making objective observations. But often what we're really doing is measuring another person's pain against our own experiences, and deciding whether their suffering deserves validation. That's exactly where I was when this story began. I was attending law school. For many people, law school is stressful. For me, as an example, it felt like much more than that. It felt like everything. Looking back now, I realized that my emotional state during that period was heavily influenced by fear. Not fear of hard work, not fear of studying, not fear of competition. I wasn't afraid of any of those things. I was afraid of failure because failure felt expensive. Failure felt dangerous. Failure felt personal. Some people enter law school with multiple safety nets beneath them. They have financial support, family support, professional connections, a cushion that can soften the landings if things don't work out exactly as planned. I never felt like I had any of that, at least not emotionally. In my mind, there was no backup plan. There was no comfortable alternative. There was no safety net waiting below. Success felt necessary. Failure felt unacceptable. And when a person begins life through that lens, something happens psychologically. They begin to believe their struggles are heavier than everyone else's, not because they're arrogant, not because they're selfish, but because pressure narrows perspective. When you're carrying heavy burden, it's easy to become consumed in your own weight, if you will. At that point in my life, I was married. I had responsibilities. I had a young daughter who had been born with Down syndrome. Anyone who has raised children understands the weight of responsibility that comes with parenthood. But when you add uncertainty, financial pressure, and concern for your child's future, that responsibility can feel overwhelming at times. I loved my daughter deeply. I still do. But I would be dishonest if I told you I never worried. I worried about her future. I worried about her opportunities. I worried about her finances. I worried about whether I would be able to provide the life she deserved. And every one of those worries intensified my determination to succeed. So when I sat in those law school classrooms, I wasn't simply pursuing a degree. In my mind, I was fighting for stability. I was fighting for security. I was fighting for a future. Now, during that period, I occasionally studied with another student named Gretchen Whitmer. Today, of course, many people know her name, but at the time, she was simply another law student, another person trying to survive one of the most demanding academic environments in the country. Now, one day we were studying together. It was fairly an ordinary day, like any other day that you could be in law school. Nothing dramatic, nothing unusual, just two law students working through the challenges of law school. Now, at some point during that conversation, she began talking about her concerns regarding law school. She expressed worry about failing out. She expressed uncertainty about what her future might look like if that had happened. She talked about the anxiety she felt. She talked about the fear that she felt. And I remember sitting there listening, at least physically, but mentally, something entirely different was happening. Because while she was talking, another conversation was taking place inside of my head. It wasn't a conversation I spoke out loud. It wasn't a conversation she ever heard. It was entirely internal. And it sounded something like this. You'll be okay. If I fail law school, I'm the one who's in trouble. You'll land on your feet. I may not. Looking back now, I can still remember how certain I felt. I wasn't questioning myself. I wasn't considering alternative perspectives. I wasn't wondering whether I might be wrong. I was convinced I understood the situation accurately. Now, from my perspective, the comparison seemed obvious. Her mother was a successful attorney. Her father was the president of Blue Cross and Blue Shield. She came from a family that, at least from my vantage point, appeared stable, successful, and supportive. Meanwhile, I was carrying responsibilities that felt enormous. I felt like there was very little room for error in my life. So as she talked about her fears, I quietly minimized them. Again, not out loud. I wasn't rude. That's not my nature. I wasn't dismissive. I wasn't disrespectful, but internally, I discounted what she was feeling. I remember thinking that if law school didn't work out for her, she still had options. I remember thinking that if law school didn't work out for me, the consequences would be much more severe. And because I believed that, I unconsciously concluded that my fear was more legitimate than hers. Now, here's the important part. At the time, I genuinely believed I was being reasonable. I thought I was being objective. I thought I was accurately assessing the reality. What I didn't understand was that I was making a mistake that millions of people make every single day. I was confusing circumstances with experience. And those two things are not the same. You see, circumstances are external. Experiences is internal. Circumstances are what happens around us. Experience is what happens within us. Circumstances can often be observed. Experience usually cannot. The younger version of me understood her circumstances. What I did not understand was her experience. And because I didn't understand her experience, I assumed I understood more than I actually did. Now, years later, I would realize that this is one of the most common failures of empathy. We look at someone's life from outside and assume we know what feels like on the inside. We see success and assume confidence. We see resources and assume security. We see support and assume peace. But human beings are much more complicated than that. At 30 years old, I hadn't learned that lesson yet. At 30 years old, I still believed suffering could be measured, compared, ranked, evaluated. And at 30 years old, I still believe that whoever carried the heaviest burden deserved the most sympathy. What I didn't know was that life was about to spend the next several decades teaching me just how wrong I was. And that lesson would come from places I'd never expected. It would come from soldiers. It would come from veterans. It would come from clients. It would come from students. It would come from parents. It would come from friends. It would come from complete strangers. Most importantly, it would come from experience itself. Because one of the greatest truths life eventually taught me is this: pain is not a competition. And I wasn't ready to understand that yet. But life was preparing to teach it anyway. Now, when I look back at that conversation now, what stands out isn't what was said. What stands out is what I didn't understand. At that time, I genuinely believed that I was seeing the situation clearly. I thought I was being objective. I thought I was evaluating reality accurately. What I didn't realize was that life was about to spend the next several decades proving me wrong. One of the interesting things about getting older is that your confidence in your own conclusions begins to soften. When we're young, we often mistake certainty for wisdom. We think confidence means we're right. We think strong opinions means deep understanding. But age has a way of humbling you. Experience has a way of exposing your blind spots. And if you're fortunate, life eventually teaches you that human beings are far more complicated than they first appear. I didn't learn that lesson all at once. I learned it slowly, piece by piece, person by person, experience by experience. I think one of the first places life began teaching me this lesson was through military service. One of the things that surprised me over the years was how differently people responded to similar circumstances. What do I mean by that? You have two soldiers go through the same deployment and come home carrying completely different emotional experiences. Two people could endure the same hardship and emerge from it entirely different ways. Early in life, I assumed hardship worked like mathematics. I thought similar inputs should produce similar outputs. But human beings aren't equations. Human beings bring their own histories into their every experience, their own fears, their own wounds, their own insecurities, their own strengths. The older I become, the more I realize that what people carry internally often matters more than what they are facing externally. Then came legal practice, and that lesson became even harder to ignore. As an attorney, I sat across from people whose lives appeared successful from the outside. They had careers and home and education, accomplishments, stability. Yet some of those same people were carrying tremendous anxiety, tremendous fear, tremendous emotional pain. And sometimes they were struggling with issues that nobody around them even knew existed. I remember realizing that external success often hides internal battles. We assume successful people feel secure. We assume confident people aren't afraid. We assume accomplished people have everything figured out. But many of the people I encountered taught me otherwise. Some of the most successful people I met were carrying enormous emotional burdens that nobody else could see. And that realization challenged something I had believed for years, because younger Thomas often evaluated people based on visible circumstances. Older Thomas slowly learned that visible circumstances rarely tell the whole story. Then came fatherhood, and fatherhood developed that lesson in ways I never expected. One of the things parenthood teaches you is that every child experiences the world differently. You can provide the same love, the same support, the same opportunities, and yet each child experiences those things through a unique emotional lens. Some children need constant reassurance. Others appear fearless. Some internalize disappointment deeply. Others bounce back quickly. As a father, I began seeing how personal emotional experience really is. I began realizing that people don't respond to life according to my expectation. They respond according to their own reality. And that reality is often invisible to everyone except them. Then came years of working with veterans. Thousands of veterans, men and women from every imaginable background, every branch of service, every rank, every walk of life. And if there's one thing that experience taught me, it's that suffering does not follow simple rules. I met veterans who had endured extraordinary events and seemed remarkably resilient. I met others whose deepest wounds came from experiences that outsiders might not immediately recognize as traumatic. And over time, I stopped trying to predict how people should feel. I stopped assuming I knew what another person's experience meant simply because I understood the facts surrounding it, because facts and feelings are not the same thing. Circumstances and experience are not the same thing. Understanding what happened to someone is not the same thing as understanding how it affected them. That's a lesson many people never learn. And if I'm honest, it took me a long time to learn that myself. Then something happened that pushed my understanding even further. During my graduate level studies in clinical mental health counseling, I encountered concepts that gave language to things I had been observing for years. I began studying how human beings process experience, how trauma works, how perception works, how emotional development works. And one of the ideals that struck me most deeply was this: people do not respond to events. They respond to their interpretation of events. Think about that for a moment, okay? Two people can experience the same circumstance and emerge with completely different realities. Not because one is weak and one is strong, not because one is right, one is wrong, but because human experience is subjective. Deeply subjective. That realization forced me to revisit many of my earlier assumptions, including the one I made sitting in that law school study session years ago with Gretchen Whitmer. Because the truth is, I never actually knew what that conversation felt like from her perspective. I only knew what it felt like from mine. I knew my fears. I knew my pressures. I knew my responsibilities. I knew my worries. What I didn't know was what she was experiencing internally. And because I didn't know, I filled in the blanks myself. That's what human beings often do. We interpret, we assume, we project, we imagine, we create stories about other people's lives based on limited information. Then we treat those stories as facts. Now, looking back, I realized that wasn't empathy, it was assumption. Empathy would have required curiosity. Empathy would have required humility. Empathy would have required recognizing that another person's emotional experience might be very different than what I imagined. Life taught me that lesson repeatedly, sometimes gently, sometimes painfully. But eventually it became impossible to ignore because the older I became, the more people I met whose lives defied my assumptions. People who looked strong but were struggling. People who looked successful but were suffering. People who looked confident but were afraid. People who looked secure but felt lost. And the more people I met, the more I realized how little we truly know about the battles fought inside another person's mind. Now that's when something began to change me. I stopped asking, who has it worse? And I started asking, what might this person be carrying that I cannot see? That single shift changed the way I listened. It changed the way I related to people. It changed the way I understood suffering. And most importantly, it changed how I understood empathy. Because empathy isn't about deciding whether or not a person's pain meets your standard or your standard of legitimacy. Empathy is recognizing that their experience is real, whether it meets your standard or not. And that realization was slowly preparing me for one of the most important lessons of my adult life, a lesson that would eventually change the way I saw other people forever. As I've gotten older, I've come to believe that one of the quiet signs of maturity is no longer feeling the need to decide whose pain matters more. When we're young, we often think life is about being right. When we think wisdom comes from having correct answers, we think understanding comes from making accurate judgment. But as age has taught me something very different, sometimes wisdom comes from realizing how little you actually know about another person's experience. That's the lesson that conversation in law school eventually taught me. Not immediately, not even a few years later. It took decades. It took military service. It took fatherhood. It took legal practice. It took counseling studies. It took listening to thousands of people tell me stories that nobody else knew. And through all of the experiences, I kept encountering the same truth over and over again. Humans are carrying far more than they appear to be carrying. The person sitting next to you might be fighting a battle you know nothing about. The person smiling at work may be struggling in ways nobody can see. The person who seems confident may be deeply insecure. The person who appears successful may be terrified of failure. The person who looks strong may be exhausted. The older I get, the more convinced I become that most people are doing the best they can with the emotional tools they have available at that moment. And once you begin seeing the world through that lens, something changes. Compassion becomes easier. Judgment becomes harder. Curiosity replaces certainty. Understanding replaces assumptions. Looking back now, I sometimes think about that younger version of myself sitting in law school. I don't criticize him. I don't condemn him. In many ways, he was doing exactly what people often do when they are carrying heavy burdens. He was looking at life through the lens of his own struggle. He was measuring the world through the weight he personally felt. And honestly, that's a very human thing to do. Most of us begin life that way. We understand our own pain first. We understand our own fears first. We understand our own burdens first. The challenge is that if we never grow beyond that perspective, we can spend our entire lives misunderstanding other people. We can spend our entire lives assuming the visible circumstances tell the whole story. We can spend our entire lives believing that because we understand someone's situation, we understand their experience. And those are not the same thing. Now, one of the greatest lessons counseling studies reinforced for me was the importance of validation. Validation is a word that gets misunderstood sometimes. People think validation means agreement. It doesn't. Validation doesn't mean saying someone is right. Validation doesn't mean pretending their fears make sense to you personally. Validation simply means recognizing that their emotional experience is real. That's all it is. And that realization changed the way I listen. When someone tells me they're struggling, I no longer immediately evaluate whether their problem is bigger or smaller than someone else's. I no longer instinctively compare their situation to my own. Instead, I try to understand what they're experiencing. Because if there's one thing life has taught me, it's that pain does not become less real simply because somebody else has it worse. Think about how often people unintentionally dismiss each other. A person talks about feeling overwhelmed, and someone responds, well, at least you have a job. A person talks about, how lonely they are, and someone responds, well, at least you're healthy. A person talks about anxiety, and someone might respond, well, other people have real problems. Most of those responses aren't malicious, at least I hope not. Most people aren't trying to be cruel. Again, I hope not. In fact, many people believe they're helping. They believe they're providing perspective. But what they're often communicating is something very different. They're communicating that the person's pain isn't important enough to be acknowledged. And that's where emotional harm can occur. Because when people feel unseen, they often stop sharing. When people feel unheard, they often withdraw. When people feel dismissed, they often become isolated. One of the things I've learned through the years of working with people is that loneliness often grows in the space between what someone is feeling and what they believe they're allowed to express. The wider that gap becomes, the more isolated people often feel. That's why listening matters. That's why empathy matters. That's why validation matters. Not because empathy solves every problem. It doesn't. Not because empathy eliminates pain. It doesn't. But because empathy reminds another human being that they don't have to carry their burden alone. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can say to another person isn't advice. Sometimes it isn't a solution. Sometimes it's not even a strategy. Sometimes it's simply, I hear you. Sometimes it's simply, that sounds difficult. Sometimes it's simply, help me understand. Those small moments of connection can mean far more than we realize. Now, looking back now, the lesson from that law school conversation had very little to do with law school. It had very little to do with careers. The real lesson was about humanity. The real lesson was about understanding. The real lesson was about recognizing that suffering is not something to be ranked. It's not something to be measured. It's not something to be compared. Pain is not a competition. Human beings are not standing in line waiting for a judge to determine whose suffering is most legitimate. Compassion is not a limited resource. Empathy is something that must be rationed. Acknowledging another person's pain does not diminish your own. Understanding another person's struggle does not invalidate your own struggle. In fact, I found that the opposite to be true. The more compassion we extend to others, the more capacity we often develop for understanding ourselves. And perhaps that's why this lesson stayed with me all these years, because eventually I realized something that younger Thomas did not understand. The goal isn't to determine who has suffered the most. The goal is to understand people better. The goal is to listen better. The goal is to love people better. The goal is to become the kind of person who can sit across from another human being and recognize that there is always more to their story than what you can see. So if there's one thing I'd leave you with today, it's this. The next time someone shares a fear with you, resist the urge to compare it. Resist the urge to measure it. Resist the urge to evaluate whether it deserves sympathy. Instead, become curious. Ask questions. Listen carefully. Try to understand what experience feels like from their side of the table, because understanding someone's circumstance is not the same as understanding their experience. I learned that lesson slowly. I learned it imperfectly. I learned it through years of life. But once I finally understood it, it changed the way I see people forever. Don't confuse understanding someone's circumstance with understanding their experience. They are not the same thing. And learning the difference may be one of the most important lessons life ever teaches you. And so there you have it. I hope this has been helpful. This is the Adjutant. And I'll see you in the next story time. I wish you all blessings and blessings. Shalom.